I'd like to bring to the stage our programmer, Rick Linklater.
Segue. I never bought into the whole Godard versus Truffaut. I mean, we all know they were buddies. They all started off together. They drifted apart. But I never,
It was just a fun sort of
it's been going on forever. It's like in every, Jay-Z, Kanye. It's in every. It's how our minds work, I think. But anyway, so it's so exciting to see this film tonight. How many of you have seen Every Man for Himself? Not that many. Wow. Or Slow Motion, as it was called in New York. When you see the movie, you'll see why it was called Slow Motion. But so this movie was heralded at the time it opened in 1980 as Godard's return to cinema. So to have a return to cinema, you have to have gone away from cinema. And I don't think anyone would doubt that he did that from about, I don't know where you would argue, 68, 69 through the 70s. He had changed so radically, the type of films he made or where his interests were. I don't think there was ever a filmmaker in film history, we can talk about this after, who was so aligned with his moment. When Godard reinvented cinema in 1960 with Breathless, and between 60 and 67, 68, they just, not many of us here were filmgoers at that time, but to hear people talk who were, I mean, it's incredible. The films just kept coming. Breathless, A Woman is a Woman, Contempt, Band Apart, A Married Woman, Parole le Fou, Band of Outsiders. I don't need to throw in some more here. I mean, there's so many. They just kept coming. Alphaville. But toward the end, when you get, My Life to Live, he was so prolific, so just revolutionary. And he changed with the times. As Vietnam and the politics of the 60s emerged, what people think of the 60s, he was right there. People say, as a filmmaker, it was like throwing meat to starving masses. A Godard film showed up and everybody went who gave a shit about art or the world or politics. He was so aligned with his moment. I just say that kind of, I don't know if there's ever been a filmmaker so aligned with a moment. And he worked very quickly. He would make films like essays, and that's kind of his style. But something's going on in the world, he makes a film about it, it's in the theater, and people are just eating it up. And then by 67, 68, I think probably Weekend, La Chinoise, somewhere in there, it kind of, his interests start going somewhere else, his politics. The titles of the film become See You at Mao, Wind from the East. You can see where his politics are going. And, the films become much more dense, much more anti-films, much more, I guess there's still a lot of humor and wit, and, it's Godard, but, they're much more of an alienating experience, much more difficult. Shooting a lot on video, and if you know 70s video, it's not like shooting on video now. It's a real radical step. Does a lot of work for TV. Has a 9-year gap between theatrical releases. I think Tao Bien in 71. And so, the year's 1980. So Godard, his return to cinema really is that. He shot a film on film, and he is reborn as a new filmmaker. And I think that's not uncommon in the arts, but it's kind of uncommon in film. You just don't see it, where, Picasso can have his different periods and we accept it, but I can't think of many filmmakers who've done that. And just talking to Lars before, I think to be reborn, he had to have gone through all that. And to become a new filmmaker, you can't just start where Godard starts here. He called this his first film, and it is. You can't really start here. You can't really imitate Godard. No one's done it. People try. He's his own guy. There'll never be another filmmaker like it. So, I mean, what to say about this film? Act like even though he's 50-ish here, it's someone's first film. It really is. You can just feel the excitement. There's a new cinematic language. I mean, that's what's so unique. A guy who reinvented cinema in the 60s was so much of his moment. I mean, I think history would probably be ready for that guy to go away, right? But he didn't go away. He kept working. He did so much in all those years that people didn't care about, and then he comes back here with really a new cinematic language. I mean, something that is, the films are beautiful, but not like in an obvious way. They're very much Godard films, which means there's something unfamiliar about them. Although there's clouds and people, you don't really. It's hard to relate to some of it. It's very funny, but you don't know you can't really anticipate anything. You don't know what's coming next. This film we're going to watch tonight, Every Man for Himself. I haven't seen, the beauty of this series for me personally is watching these films again. I haven't seen this in 35. I haven't seen this film lately, but I really look forward to, watching it again and feeling it again. But what I remember, there's 3 lead characters. There's a guy, Paul, who's, if I was an academic, I would have watched it. I made a joke about this earlier in the series. I would do my homework and tell you what to think, but I'm just trying to re-experience it again myself. So the plot, what plot? It's a Godard film. There's 3 characters. One guy works for Swiss TV. His name's Godard. 2 women, Natalie Baye and Isabelle Huppert, 2 of the great French actresses of all time, particularly this era. One's working with, Natalie Baye works with Godard and is having an affair with him. She's very restless. He described this movie as one woman's moving too fast, the other's too slow. The other one, Isabella Huppert, is a country girl who's now a prostitute, but more grounded and together than any of them. Again, Godard film. This film is actually, he bases some of it on some Charles Bukowski stories. Before people in the U.S. really knew who Bukowski was, Godard based, I think, some of the more funny, pervy things going on. A lot of that's Bukowski. And, God, what else to say? Well, just enjoy this. I think another great joy for me personally with this series is really having to think about the cinema of this era. Last week, I rattled off a list of films that came out in 1980 because we were showing Melvin and Howard. And the real point, despite the title of this series, Jewels in the Wasteland, I think that wasteland doesn't really start until we're still in a 70s hangover. The 80s haven't really started, the one we're referring to. That's probably 83. That's the next round of programming here. It's still a really vibrant time. When I listed all those films, the last 2 I mentioned were Heaven's Gate and Popeye, 2 very different films, but I saw an interview recently with Coppola and Scorsese from like 97. It's on YouTube. But they were both saying Heaven's Gate really changed the industry, and it's absolutely true. And they talked about how much they struggled in the 80s. And if they were struggling, guys like Altman were kicked out of the industry, and how different it was. And all those films were American films. I think Godard, what happens in the 80s, starting with this film, and what was so exciting to be getting, discovering cinema in the 80s for the first time as an adult cinema goer, to catch this era in the 80s felt like a new wave. It felt like, oh my God, here's this master. And I'm seeing all the old films too as they come around. But to see the new Godard film was amazing. It was this film and Passion and First Name Carmen and Hail Mary and King Lear and Detective. Every year there's a new Godard film, and they're just all extremely beautiful, fascinating. You're entering his own cinematic landscape, and it's unlike anybody else's. Like I would say, you can't imitate a Godard film. But I would plant my flag now and say, as much as everyone else was struggling, I'm ready to say, this gets around to your point, Lars, that Godard is the filmmaker of the 80s. And so I think it starts here with this film tonight. I can't think of one guy who made his own films, had such a successful decade in that regard artistically. But, he's in France and Switzerland. The U.S. was much more of a struggle. So that's what this film, we're jumping over, the pond and seeing what was going on over there. And it's really exciting. Just take it in as a whole new experience. And, you're in his world, but he makes it fun. And we'll be around after. We'll talk about anything, but I'm really excited to see it with you guys. Okay, thanks for being here. every time I introduce the film, I always think, like, as soon as I sit down, I think all the things I didn't say. And one of the things I would have said before, for those who don't know Godard very well, to orientate you a little bit, you have to kind of throw all your notions of drama, 3-act structure, what we bring to most movies. You put that aside. You're in his world, that kind of aphoristic, the way characters talk. If you really think about it, you go through we're talking 50 years of films now, and there's not one character who has a past or a future. There's no references that we all would kind of cling to. They're not, what are they? They're even characters. They're it's just a whole different language. But I find it
photographic subjects.
Yeah,
in a way.
And they speak. He has entire films where they're really just quoting. He's quoting other films. He's quoting books, literature, just everything. But that's how it always has been. That's not a completely new element here. That's in Breathless. When they're in the hotel, in that room, in the apartment for 17 minutes or whatever, and they're just kind of, quoting and.
They sort of remind me of
like mouthpieces.
They're like, it's like a notebook. Like when you watch his films, it's like you're thumbing through a notebook, and he's taken these photos, he's put them there, and he's put like quotes that he's sort of like a quote from Chairman Mao or something, or just quotes from all over, or from an advertisement. You just flipping through the book.
Yeah, and a lot of his later '60s, some of those really hardcore political films, they actually have a lot of graphics. He'll. There's a little bit in this, but there's even more back then.
And wordplay, of course.
Often really funny. Yeah. So,
they're challenging films with an audience.
To say the least. But I don't know. It's always fascinating and beautiful. It's like not trying to be beautiful, just kind of is. It's just images and sound. I would have mentioned more about the sound too. I think that's his biggest innovation. Is probably is just his use of sound, the juxtaposition, what you don't. You have to think about it.
And
I'd forgotten about that incredible scene where, you hear a train going by, you hear all that just on top of it. I mean, that breaks obviously every rule that you would ever, want to add to an audience's, ease of perception into the movie. But he's always called, Brechtian, that he wants you to know you're watching a movie. You're watching a construct. You're not. He doesn't want you to just wake up and, where have I been the last 90 minutes? I forgot. I was transported. It's like, no, he's kind of getting right to you directly. You have to think about your life. You have to think about politics. You have to think about, what this symbolizes, what it means. What does prostitution mean? You have to dig through all that. But I saw this interview, just a YouTube thing I remember seeing along back in the day. It was the Dick Cavett show. There's an hour-long interview with Godard for this film, and Cavett's trying to keep up with. You can just YouTube it. It's pretty amazing.
I'll post it on AFS Viewfinders on Facebook tomorrow.
Yeah, but check it out. I remember seeing it back, maybe not that year, but he repeated them a couple years later and just had directors all week. And I remember watching it thinking, just the way he speaks, his enigmatic, you see how his brain works. Mm-hmm. It's just, he's such a fascinating, unique thinker. Just his answers to, and you can see Dick Cavett struggling to keep up with him and trying to be, it's pretty funny. But, he says some kind of incredible things. But one of the things he says, just personal development, he says this is the first film he'd done, because there was so much made about this return to filmmaking. And that's all true. That's not myth or anything. He was saying it, and it's just absolutely true. But he was saying it's the first film, he felt free. It was the first film he did without angst, without anxiety. I think he felt free to experiment like that and to push all the boundaries and maybe explore all these other things, in one film. But it continues, maybe in certain ways not as extreme, but in others, yeah. The films, and the dude's 83, he's still doing it. He's had an incredible third act. And I remember in the 80s thinking like, everyone's always going to worship masculine, feminine, and Breathless, and that'll be in his obit, they're going to talk about Breathless and those. But I remember in the 80s and even into the 90s, all the great films he made in the 90s, I was thinking like, God, this is really his best era. Mm-hmm. There's a spiritual element, there's just, it's so, to me, more interesting than the the 60s that are so like they're so alive, but I don't know, something this other era to me is more interesting in a strange way.
Yeah, it's like he has the benefit of his whole life of reflection. I remember watching one at AFS.
It's mature.
From 95 or something. It's called Et là pour moi, I believe. And there's a scene. Yeah, there's a scene in that's like, I remember this like a long scene, like a 10-minute scene where a woman just looks through, she sits in the sunlight in a window and just looks through an art book. And it's just her turning the pages in this art book. And it's just like, it's just mind-blowing.
You got to give yourself over to it, that's for sure. But it's always probably beautifully lit, natural light, no doubt.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, he's such a bizarre and interesting figure. And like when you see his films from the 60s, it's like, yeah, the 60s are beautiful. It's not hard to see that. But to watch these, like the 80s weren't beautiful, let's face it. And to like look at this.
But he's, gas stations, trains, they're very modern.
Yeah.
It feels very modern.
Well, he finds like a sort of beauty in the 80s, the cars and the hairstyles and the clothes and all that.
And it's just of a moment. I think he's probably the most in the moment filmmaker ever. Like what I was just saying, his characters are absolutely in the moment. There's no nostalgia. There's no, clinging to a past or it's totally unique. It just flies in the face of, storytelling, everything you've ever heard about it. I think. Some people like the earlier films more. I think they felt they could empathize more with the characters, but I don't necessarily agree. I think they're very similar in a way. You just might have thought they were younger and hipper maybe sometimes, but
Did anybody hate that movie, by the way?
You just hate it. Be honest.
It's okay. That's totally acceptable.
Really, you got to start somewhere.
Right over here.
I hadn't seen it before, and the 60s movies backwards and forwards and some of the other, but this one I hadn't seen before, and it was really great. But the thing that kind of really, I wanted to ask about was this view of male-female relations in this movie, because I remember when Lars first started asking about Godard on the AFS Facebook page back in the fall, and someone commented that because we were having this debate over whether or not to do, which was better even before you programmed it, and someone said, oh, they can't stand Godard because he's so sexist, and I was just sort of like, wait, because I focused on his 60s movies, I wasn't really seeing that. But that comment is really sort of like lodged in my brain, and so I've been thinking about it since then, and this movie I did love, but I mean, it also has a much more acidic view of male-female relationships than associated with the 60s movies. I mean, even prostitution in 2 or 3 Things I Know About Her is sort of more
in so many movies.
It's sort of like charming and uniquely French, and in here it's a little more, I don't know, it seems more exploitative in this movie.
Well, isn't it always? Well, technically, I guess it always is.
It's a big metaphor for him. It feels like about capitalism and the way the world works and the way you have to sell yourself in life.
You have to think about it, but I wouldn't pretend to be able to say this is what he's saying with that. But it is certainly a recurring, theme in so many of his movies. Just about,
Well, you've got these businessmen hiring these prostitutes, sitting behind a desk. The one guy wants to make deals on his phone, and the other like
that one is from a Bukowski short story.
Yeah.
Skip the prostitution. I mean, there's also too
the couples.
There's the women getting slapped a few times. There's the incest fantasizing going on.
Really disturbing.
There's more.
I'd kind of forgotten all that.
Going on.
I swear that's not what I remember from this movie at all. I remember that at the desk, that part is kind of hard to forget. But the other parts, you're like, oh, wow.
There's the incest stuff in his other movies around this time, too, though.
Yeah, well, okay, so he's an old perv. But he's a middle-aged perv, I guess. Now he's an old perv. But, I want to say one thing. My friend Julie Delpy worked with him on Detective a few years after this. She was like 14 years old. Mm-hmm. But she says, and she remains friends with him today. She loves him, by the way. And just said he's wonderful. But he said, you should see him read a book. What do you mean? He's like, oh, she handed her a book, and he starts at the end of the book. Always starts at the last, and then works backwards, jumps around, and then hands the book back. Like, that's how he reads a book. I was like, okay, that's just the way his brain's wired. You know, it's like, he kind of feels that way. I just thought I'd throw out that.
That is such a quintessential Godard
observation.
anecdote.
Yeah, and it's not an act. I just think he probably couldn't technically read a book A to Z.
Have you met him?
No, I haven't. No.
It's weird.
No, I don't know.
He lives in Switzerland now?
Yeah, I mean, he's pretty. I don't know if he'd want to meet. I mean, you know, what do you? He seems
I just would have thought, like, in the years of
the
years of going to Cannes and stuff, that you would have met him.
Yeah, but like, man, I don't know. No, he's not. He's not out. As far as I can tell, he's not really out and about. You don't run into him in a festival elevator. You know? But
so how in the hell does he get movies made still? How does he get budgets to make movies?
I think he does them pretty cheap.
Yeah.
You know, he always did, but I think he really perfected a small operation, and it's really admirable. You know, how he's done his career. I think at the end of the day, I mean, he's still alive, so no one will sum it up. You know, but I think that's what makes him so. You know, he's had one of the more unique careers that the longevity he was blessed with, and what he's done with that time, and you know, all the different kind of stuff he's done. But he's always kept it low. It's kind of how he sees himself as a filmmaker too. You know, I would never do this, but I brought my phone here because a friend of mine texted a quote from Godard I wanted to read along these lines about how he sees himself in his career. Okay, here's a Godard quote. The great filmmakers always tie themselves down by complying with the rules of the game. I have not done so because I'm a minor filmmaker. You know, that's how he. That's freedom. You know, and another quote I remember, is he was saying how he saw his career, and they were talking about success and, you know, bigger films, and he says, no, I just always saw myself making a lot of unsuccessful movies. You know? As a filmmaker, you gotta love this guy. It's like, that's the right attitude, actually. That's a good vision of, this world. So, you know, he and yet he's kind of all of our, you know, nutty professor of cinema. He's done so many films now. That History of Cinema, I don't know if you know that. It's out on DVD last few years.
Yeah.
But, you know, just how many hours would you add? I mean, he's done the history of cinema. He feels like it's his, how would you say it? Obligation, job. I mean, he's really carrying a torch for cinema that few others have, in his own kind of crazy way.
Yeah, that thing is unbelievable. You should.
Yeah.
They've got it at Vulcan South at least.
Yeah,
They've probably got it someplace else. It's like this, only it's like a historical treatise about cinema, but it's like incredibly. It's opinionated,
dense, and you know, talk about meeting him. I mean, he's notoriously confrontational. I think he's I think he sees himself as a critic. He was a critic. All those Coyote Cinema guys were. They started off as writers, critics. They took on the established order in their country for sure. But he's really harsh on colleagues and friends, and you know, you see interviews with him. He's interviewing someone from a film, and they think they're an old friend, and he's just ripping them to shreds about something. And a notoriously huge falling out with Truffaut, just because, I mean, they're so fundamentally different filmmakers. And I think he's not above a lot of professional jealousy. Truffaut had a great 70s, where Godard fell away and became irrelevant to most people, or irritating or hated. And just Truffaut had, you know, talk about a great decade. What Godard had in the 80s, Truffaut had in the 70s. I mean, he didn't make a bad film. It just boom, 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 boom. I mean, that was one of the better decades ever. And I think he's probably just jealous. You know, he's winning Academy Awards for Best Foreign Film. And so his critique of his friend gets worse and harsher. You know, and finally Truffaut's, you know what, fuck you, you know? I don't have to put up with this shit. And they never spoke again, you know? It's like public writings. It's like, you don't do that to a friend, you know? But I think his higher calling was to, you know, I don't know what belief he had. I mean, those guys are very different in their approach to film. Let's face it, everybody's going to be different from Godard. What's his standard? Himself? I mean, I don't know, but...
You just couldn't do a movie like this right over here.
Did he have a radical
sound designer that he worked with, or is that him?
I don't think it. Yeah, it's him. You see it in his early films. I think that's just when he talks about film. He does. It's always image and sound. He's always talking about sound. In all his writings, his theory, graphic. It'll always be sound and image, kind of the juxtaposition of that. So I think that's the core of his cinematic thinking is, sound.
There's that great part in Weekend where the woman's telling the whole sex story, and then underneath it is like this unbelievably anxious music.
Yeah,
that's just playing, and it just changes the whole character of the scene.
And this, just the tempo changes are just amazing. I mean, you would never. I mean, there's who even experiments with that, but he really doesn't give a fuck. And the way I find it really incredible. Because it tells you, well, we're that manipulated. Like, oh, well, music, okay. What are my expectations? That's why I like these movies, because you just think the whole time. It's like turning your brain on and perceiving, just like any art, I guess.
A lot of people say, oh, I like a movie where you can turn your brain off. Like you've been working it so hard.
Well, we don't like those movies, but
turn your brain on sometimes.
Yeah. Well, this kind of makes you do that.
Right over here.
I considered this film to be really ambient, and I think it was intended to trigger a lot of personal things, so intentionally left vague. But the one thing that totally was over my head was, what was the deal with the opera singer? Was that supposed to be? And that was just because it was very loud and obvious, but it didn't really make me think of anything.
I don't know. Does anyone who maybe understands the language, the opera singer, does any of that? Can anybody have an answer? I don't pretend to. Except,
Very beautiful.
Beautiful.
And
I
then
think it's purely
he's like,
aesthetic.
shut up. He's like, shut up.
He might not know. You know what I mean? It's just he hears it and he's like, okay, that fits here.
Well, it was beautiful, but it was also really annoying and cloying at times.
Kind of like a painter who does something and just, why are they adding a third nose to it? Because that's how that should be. Maybe it's I don't know how much theory goes behind it, or is it just an impulse that he's
And it may have been
following?
something that he heard that day, because it's not like Godard was storyboarding. I mean, he was having ideas on the day, his working method. Is
notoriously scriptless.
Yeah. So it may have
Quotes,
just heard it.
Just a notebook, maybe a little. In this Dick Cavett interview, he's kind of hustling. He's doing a huge American tour. He's really kind of selling it, which is strange for him. But he's talking to trying to get a few American stars to be in it. He was always great at that. You get Brigitte Bardot, and then you just kind of have her lay there naked the whole movie or whatever. He always had fun uses for stars. But he's hustling, in the U.S. And Dick Cavett asked him, well, what scripts? What do you have? And he pulls out these two little notebooks like that big. And they're like that thin and this big. And he goes, well, here are my two next films. And it's like these little, and he's like, oh, but there's only 3 words on a page. He's like, yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Right back here, I saw you first.
There was a lot of reference to sound. You talked about sound and image. The whole thing of the music swelling at the end, and she goes down the alley and there's an orchestra. That's very much like the opera singer. And even in that memorable scene you were talking about, it's like, all right, now let's get the sound.
Yeah.
So and then
he's the orchestrator.
There was also
this
several times random characters went, "What's that music? Do you hear that music?" Just apropos to nothing. And for me, it just pointed out sort of the artificiality of music in films.
Yeah.
Why aren't the characters saying, "What is that music?"
How different is an opera than a train going by?
Yeah.
It's sound. One's music, one's sound.
There's a great scene outside the theater in the line where they're like, "There's no sound in the movie."
I think we've cracked the code here. It's all about sound.
Vincent, do you have something to say? Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, one thing that I'm curious about is most Godard films. They're credited. Godard is the writer. He's the director and he's the writer. This one, the credits go by almost intentionally too fast for you to read, but I noticed, Anne-Marie Melville, which makes sense, they'd been collaborating through the whole 70s, but Jean-Claude Carrier was credited as a writer on this. I'm curious if you know anything about his involvement.
have no idea. I can't imagine him sitting around a table and collaborating on a script. I mean, maybe he had some lifts from the work or something, and that was a legal thing. Maybe, when you see these, some of his credits are just jokes too. I mean, you see a name and you go, well, they haven't been alive for 20 years. You don't really know what he's saying sometimes with his credits. But,
It doesn't seem like any of Carrier's other scripts very much.
Yeah.
It's so unusual to see Godard potentially collaborating with
Like
another
this
writer
five-
who has such a strong voice.
Yeah, but yeah, a lot of his films were with his wife, Anne-Marie.
And they edited together, right?
Yeah, they're kind of
Yeah.
they're
Kind of 2-for-1
a
deal.
team.
And the other about credits, we were just talking about. There's another one. It may be King Lear, where at the end you just see like the credits just go by so fast you couldn't possibly read
It
it.
kind of doesn't even happen. It's like a one frame pop, like
Yeah.
and then there's like 20 credits on a freeze frame, and it's over. It's like, okay, well, legally I had to put these on there because he did that one for Canon.
Yeah.
Remember Golan and Globus of the '80s? I think he was just kind of
King Lear's
talk
a
about
really
biting the hand.
That's a really unusual and interesting movie with like Norman Mailer and Woody Allen and Molly Ringwald and
Burgess Meredith.
Burgess Meredith.
That's Lear.
And it starts off at the beginning with just a conversation of him and Menachem Golan about
Yeah, it's like
how
the
the
tape
movie
machine. Isn't it a message?
Yeah, it's a phone message.
Isn't it? Yeah.
It's like, Jean-Luc, can you please deliver this film?
We want this to be a film about, they have all these commercial ambitions for
Yeah.
it. And he's kind of like, I think he, kind of like Joseph Levine when he did Contempt in '63, it was like, Godard was a big international name and he gets, he's like, I gave him Bardot, I gave him Palance, I gave him, that, and what did he give me? A piece of shit. He's just like,
a piece of shit that is shown in cinemas
still
all the
watched.
time. Still.
Yeah, that,
far more than any
of
other
his
Joseph
other
Levine
films.
movies.
Yeah, but at that moment, probably for the rest of his life, this piece of shit guy stole from me. Yeah, so he wasn't afraid to bite the hand.
For the people who just saw this, and maybe this is one of their first Godard films, or maybe they didn't like it, you'll notice a weird thing happening. Is this movie's going to expand inside your head for days, then for weeks, then for years. It's just there are images that are going to lodge in there and take root.
It'll be a little unpredictable what you remember, what you don't. But it'll, in my mind, they're good memories. I like these experiences because years later, I just think of what you felt watching it. You kind of want to do it again.
Yeah, it really sticks with you, and it's a really unconventional way of telling a story in a film, certainly.
Yeah,
but it's like a poem more than a story, really, and it will stick with you
for sure. So, before I forget, I really want to promote next week's show, Star 80, which that's my theory that the 70s end next week in 1983 with Bob Fosse's what he thought was his best film, which is for him saying a lot. Star 80, which is kind of just this kind of incredible indictment of a moment in American culture that you just can't believe Hollywood made about itself, more or less. And so I don't know how many of you have seen it, but I'm really curious to see it again because talk about a film that stayed with me all these years, and everybody. But it's a.
When we sat down to start programming the series, I should tell people that we were kind of going through the titles, and it was just like, okay, Diner, and you were like, Diner.
Has everybody seen it?
Yeah.
It's like, what have people not seen?
We get to Star 80, and you're like, yeah, absolutely, that's
a must.
Number one. Got it. Go ahead and plug it in.
Yeah, that was an absolute must.
Yeah, that was
for
the
whatever
one.
reason. Yeah, Eric Roberts gives this just chillingly brilliant performance as this kind of. He's like a, kind of a pimp. I mean, he's not technically a pimp, but that's sort of his personality. But he's kind of with classier pimps. I think that's Fosse's view of the culture.
There have been a lot of movies about fame, but this one's just really gets in there.
It's the quest for it or to be somebody. It's kind of, you couldn't get more opposite than last week's film, Melvin and Howard and Star 80.
Yeah. I'm glad we had this little buffer between. This little palate
and if you want to
cleanser.
do any research, I mean, All That Jazz is actually not a bad jumping off of his previous film, even though I know we're showing it.
Yeah.
not too long into the future. But if you wanted to check that out again before next week, it's his next film and his last film. He made 2 last films. Not a lot of filmmakers get that opportunity. He made All That Jazz is a good last film, and
Kind of
Star
dying.
80 is the last film.
Yeah. So All That Jazz is like a summing up of my career, and I'm dying, and all that kind of stuff is about dying, and then Star 80 gets to be
Really, yeah. And that to me, when I think of 80s cinema, that was kind of the end. That was Hollywood really quit making films like that. That was the same year King of Comedy. All these little 70s type films were still hanging around, but boy, was it over. I was saying that earlier there were these big fiasco type films, Heaven's Gate, Popeye. Even, I remember at the time that the feeling was, in Hollywood, heads of studios would say, we've got to wrangle these films back from the creative people. And Chris Christopherson had a quote, because he was in Heaven's Gate, as was Isabelle Huppert. He's like, well, then who do we give it to? The uncreative people? I mean, what are you talking about? But that's exactly what they did.
Yeah, it's true.
And and so there was this huge struggle going on, but a few people were able to get those films made. And Fosse had a lot of clout, but boy, is that a film it was when you look in the mirror, I'm talking about our culture at that moment, you look in the mirror, what you saw back was so dark. People just went they couldn't even see the critique. It was just so scathing. So
Yeah, so that's next week, Star 80. You're all going to be here, right?
yeah,
All right,
I tell
good.
you won't forget it.
All right.
It's despite its kind of tragic underpinnings, there's actually a lot of strange humor, and it's got a lot of life. It's Bob Fosse. Hey, the razzle dazzle. Don't forget. I mean, he's one of the greats. So
All right, we'll see you all
quite a
next
film.
week for that, and thank you all
So,
for coming
yeah.
out. And thank you for doing this.
Yes.